The agreement that may decide whether the Middle East goes back to war this summer was signed by two governments, but its survival rests on two others, and neither of them signed it. On June 22, 2026, the United States and Iran walked out of a Swiss mountain resort with a 60-day roadmap to end their war. Within hours, the people who can break that roadmap weren't even in the building. They were in southern Lebanon. I'm Dr. Naim Tahir Baig. This is a strategic deep dive into the deal everyone is calling a breakthrough, and the structural reason it may not hold. Before we start, one promise. This is a war with passionate partisans, and you might be expecting me to tell you who's winning. I won't. Instead, I'll give you a single analytic test, a framework political scientists use to predict when peace deals survive, and I'll run it on this case honestly, including where it cuts against my own conclusion. Here's the root. First, what was actually agreed in Switzerland. Second, the one idea that explains the whole thing, the commitment problem. Third, 5 specific testable predictions. Fourth, and this is the part I care most about, the live evidence that's already complicating the official story, and the strongest case against my own thesis. Then where this goes next. Methodology stays short, substance lands early. Quickly, how we got here, because the timeline matters for what follows. Late February 2026, the United States and Israel launch large-scale strikes on Iran. The war pulls in Lebanon within days, where Israel and the Iran-backed group Hezbollah resume open fighting. Over the following months, the human cost runs into the thousands, with more than 1 million people displaced in Lebanon. The Strait of Hormuz, the channel that normally carries about a fifth of the world's seaborne oil, becomes a weapon, opened and closed. Then, in mid-June, a memorandum of understanding between Presidents Trump and Pezeshkian. And on June 21st and 22nd, the first direct high-level talks at the Bergenstock Resort above Lake Lucerne, mediated by Qatar and Pakistan. So what did they actually agree? 4 things, and notice that each one asks somebody to move first. 1. Nuclear. A stated commitment to bring international inspectors back into Iran and to negotiate the fate of Iran's enriched uranium. 2. The Strait of Hormuz, a mechanism to keep it open, paired with a temporary 60-day US license letting Iran sell oil again. 3. Lebanon, a so-called deconfliction cell, a hotline to stop local clashes from detonating the whole deal. 4. Process, a 60-day clock to turn this sketch into a treaty with a high-level committee overseeing it. The US Vice President's own words were telling. He called it, and I'm quoting the reported characterization, the foundation, not the house. That's not modesty. As we'll see, it's an accurate description of an agreement that postponed every hard question. Here is the number the whole war turns on. By the time inspectors last verified it, Iran had accumulated roughly 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%. That is not a bomb, but it is the hardest, most expensive, most irreversible step on the path to one. And it sits well above what any civilian power program needs. The framework does not resolve what happens to it. It defers it. And that single deferral is not a footnote. On the reading I'll defend today, it is the structural fault line running under everything signed in Switzerland. To see why a deferral is so dangerous, we need the one idea this whole analysis rests on. Start with a puzzle that sounds almost naive. War is enormously costly. So for almost any war, there exists some deal both sides would prefer to fighting. Then why do rational, well-informed governments fight anyway? The political scientist's answer is that war is a bargaining failure, and it has a few specific causes. One of them dominates this case, the commitment problem. Sometimes a deal requires one side to take a step that permanently changes the balance of power between them. And once that step is taken, nothing stops the other side from exploiting the new advantage. Knowing this in advance, the first side refuses to move. The deal that would benefit everyone never gets signed. Not from irrationality, but from the impossibility of a credible promise. Now map that onto Switzerland. The deal asks Iran to give up the one asset that deters a future attack, its enriched uranium and its capacity to make more. That move is, for practical purposes, irreversible. In exchange, the United States offers sanctions relief. But sanctions relief is the most reversible concession in the toolkit. We have direct evidence of that, because the US walked out of the last nuclear deal in 2018 and reimposed everything. So Iran is asked to make a permanent concession in return for a temporary one. On this reading, no amount of good faith fixes that. It's not about trust, it's about the structure of the exchange. One important nuance, because critics will pounce here. I am not claiming Iran's uranium lets it blackmail anyone to grab territory or extract concessions by waving a bomb. The scholarship is actually skeptical that nuclear weapons work as tools of blackmail. The leverage runs the other way. The stockpile is defensive, it raises the cost of attacking Iran, and it makes Iran's threat to rebuild credible if the deal collapses. That's deterrence, not blackmail, and it's exactly why giving it away is so hard to compensate. A framework you can't test is just an opinion with footnotes. So here's the discipline. 5 predictions, each with a specific dated thing you can watch for, and each one able to prove me wrong. Let me walk them. Hypothesis 1. Verification. If inspectors get on-site access quickly, the framework holds in the short run, because transparency substitutes for the trust these two don't have. But, and this mirrors the nuance from a moment ago, verification is necessary, not sufficient. Inspectors can confirm Iran is complying today without changing what surrendering the stockpile would cost it tomorrow. So prompt access supports survival, it does not resolve the core problem. Watch for on-site access within about 30 days, call it July 21st. Hypothesis 2 is the heart of it, the power shift. Demands that Iran ship out or surrender the stockpile should fail because no guarantee can compensate it for the permanent loss of leverage. The arrangement most likely to actually survive is the messy middle, diluting the material inside Iran under monitoring rather than removing it. And here's the trap in that compromise. It's precisely the outcome hardliners in Washington and Israel will reject as too soft. So the very deal the theory predicts can hold is the one domestic politics may not allow. Watch for whether any verifiable disposition mechanism even exists by the 60-day deadline. Hypothesis 3. The mediators. Qatar and Pakistan aren't neutral. They have real regional stakes, and counterintuitively, that's what makes them useful. A mediator with skin in the game can credibly tell each side the other is serious. The prediction is concrete. When these talks break down, it should be mediator intervention that restarts them, not spontaneous goodwill. The disconfirming test is just as concrete. If the parties resume on their own with no mediation, my account is wrong, the mediators weren't doing the work I claim. Hypothesis 4 brings us back to where we started. Israel and Hezbollah are not parties to this agreement, yet either can shatter it with a single military move in Lebanon. That's veto power without a signature. The prediction, the framework's durability should move inversely with the intensity of fighting in Lebanon. When the South flares, the talk should wobble. We don't have to wait to test this one. It already happened, and I'll show you in a minute. Hypothesis 5. Audience costs. Leaders who stake out loud, specific public positions find them painful to abandon. The climb down has a domestic price. So the most publicly pledged positions, Iran on enrichment, Israel's nuclear red line, the US on Hormuz tolls, should be the last to move and the likeliest to trigger a breakdown. But I want to be fair to the counter case, because it's strong. Audience cost theory was built on democracies answering to voters. Iran's leadership answers to a managed elite, not an electorate. The cost may not transmit. And on the American side, this president has reversed loud public positions before without paying much of a price. So this is a genuinely open test, not a foregone one. If publicly pledged positions move as easily as quiet technical ones, hypothesis 5 fails. Now the part I find most important, and it's unfolding as this goes out, so bear the date in mind. Everything here is as of June 22nd, 2026. The single most celebrated win from Switzerland was this. Iran agreed to bring back nuclear inspectors, the US. Vice President called it a major milestone and said inspections could resume within the week, except Iranian state and Revolutionary Guard-linked media said the opposite the same day. One agency reported the inspectors were not discussed. A state outlet said Iran did not negotiate over its nuclear file. And a third argued openly that nuclear ambiguity, keeping the West guessing about where the material is one of Tehran's key assets, and that letting inspectors in would help the enemy. I cannot confirm which account is true. That's the point. The headline achievement is contested at birth, and notice it's contested over exactly the irreversible step my second hypothesis says is the hardest to take. The crack is right where the theory said the fault line was. And hypothesis 4, the non-signatories didn't wait either. Days before the talks, Israeli strikes in Lebanon and Hezbollah's response spiked. The Switzerland talks were postponed. They only went ahead after a renewed Israel-Hezbollah ceasefire was patched together. Iran even reclosed the Strait of Hormuz in protest, though the US military disputed that the closure was real. So two parties who never signed the agreement delayed it, nearly killed it, and shaped its timing, exactly as predicted. On this one, the evidence is already in. Now I owe you the honest part, the strongest case that I'm wrong. If I only gave you confirmations, I'd be selling you something, not analyzing it. Counter argument 1. The optimists read. Maybe the commitment problem is real but manageable. The same scholarship that names the problem also names the fix. Phased, verified, reciprocal steps that let each side move a little at a time. That's what the 60-day clock and the inspector regime are for. If that machinery turns, my pessimism is misplaced. Counter argument 2. Maybe I'm reading the wrong mechanism. Suppose the deal collapses. My thesis says it should collapse over the irreversible stockpile step. But it might instead collapse because a leader makes a loud speech he can't walk back. That's audience costs, hypothesis 5, or simply because Israel strikes again, hypothesis 4. If the breakdown clearly traces to a public climb down or a Lebanon flare, and not to the stockpile, then the commitment problem wasn't the binding constraint, and I was wrong about what's really driving this. Counter argument 3. The financial channel. There's a reported mechanism built with Qatar to release frozen Iranian funds under tight conditional control. If money can be staged and reversed in small, monitored tranches, you've partly engineered around the irreversibility problem on at least one front. That's a real dent in my argument. I don't think these defeat the thesis, but a thesis that can't be defeated isn't a thesis. So watch the collapse if it comes and watch where it starts. Which means I owe you one more thing. A way to tell my mechanism apart from its rivals, so I can't just claim victory either way. Here's the discriminating test. If this framework fails, ask one question: where did the break originate? If it breaks at the point of taking the first irreversible step, the stockpile, the on-site access, while Lebanon stays quiet and no leader has just made a dramatic public reversal, that points to the commitment problem. If instead it breaks right after a public pledge hardens, that's audience costs. And if it breaks because the south of Lebanon erupts again, that's the veto player story. Same collapse, 3 different fingerprints. I'm telling you in advance which one would vindicate my reading, and which ones would sink it. We've seen versions of this before, and the precedents discipline the forecast. They don't flatter it. The 2015 nuclear deal solved the commitment problem the textbook way. Deep, continuous verification and phased relief, and it still collapsed because relief turned out to be reversible when a new administration walked away. The 2006 ceasefire that ended the last big Israel-Hezbollah war deferred Hezbollah's disarmament and leaned on monitoring without binding the armed group, and the fighting eventually came back. North Korea's freeze deals brought real-time and verification, and then unraveled as each side's incentives reasserted themselves. The latent capability was never reversed. The pattern across all 3 is brutally consistent. Verification buys time. It does not by itself overcome the incentive to keep the capability. That is the weight of evidence the Switzerland framework is sailing against. So where does the test come out? On the balance of theory and the early evidence, my provisional reading is this. The most likely outcome is not a durable settlement within 60 days, and not an immediate return to all-out war. It's something in between, a managed, unstable détente. Talks that limp forward, punctuated by crises, with the hardest question, the stockpile, repeatedly postponed rather than solved. I hold that conclusion loosely, on purpose. It's a provisional falsifiable claim, not a prophecy. The whole value of running an honest test is that the next 60 days can prove it wrong, and I've told you exactly what would. If you remember nothing else, remember this watch list. 6 things, with dates, that turn this from commentary into a test you can score yourself. 1. Are inspectors actually on site by around July 21st? 2. Does a verifiable plan for the uranium exist by the 60-day mark in late August? 3. Does that 60-day oil license get renewed past August 21st or quietly lapse? 4. Do Qatar and Pakistan stay in the room? 5. Does Lebanon flare again and stall the talks? And 6. Do the loud, publicly pledged red lines move slower than the quiet, technical ones? Score those yourself over the summer. That's the difference between watching the news and reading the strategy underneath it. The deal in Switzerland was signed by two governments and can be broken by two others. That's not a flaw in my analysis, it's the actual architecture of this piece, and it's why I'd watch Lebanon as closely as Lucerne. If this way of thinking, testable, attributed, willing to argue against itself, is what you come here for, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next deep dive. I'm Dr. Naim Tahir Baig. Thanks for thinking it through with me.